in any way the plans for the State of the Union tonight?
I don't believe so. I'm certain that the President will feel compelled to mention this, depending on the outcome of what we learn here in a few minutes.
Will it affect the shuttle program?
Well, that's hard to say, you know, here in 15 or 20 minutes after an incident of this type is concerned. I'm sure it will not affect the United States' determination to consider to continue the exploration of space and all the benefits we've received from it.
Can you tell us anything else about the schedule?
While this is indeed tragic, it certainly will not deter the United States in its interest in space exploration.
Well, with all the problems that the shuttle has had, will any substantial reevaluation be done of the program itself?
Well, once again, you're very premature in asking a question concerning the future of the space program. The United States has met adversity many times before in the space program. It is one of the most effective and successful programs of that type that any country has ever undertaken.
Larry, can you tell us anything specifically that the President said, any quotations, and did he make any mention of the fact that the teacher that he suggested, that the program of a teacher in space, that teacher was on board this flight?
Well, I know that was on his mind. Quite frankly, the President stood there in almost stunned silence as he watched the television. You could certainly read the concern, the sorrow, the anxiety on his face as he watched, and the group watched around him. As I say, he was virtually watched in silence.
Might anyone from the White House be leading some sort of investigating team, or will it just be up to NASA to investigate this?
All this is very, very early, and there's just nothing we can say. Our immediate concern is the crew, and all of these other questions will just have to be deferred until much later.
Was anything said about the fact that the teacher was on board this plane?
Well, it was something that was on all of our minds, that we did have the first teacher in space, really the first civilian, so to speak, other than our members of Congress who have flown in space, and certainly that's on our mind.
Are there any scientific aides who have been able to say that they could survive such an explosion?
Just don't have that kind of information yet.
You said that the Vice President, Admiral Poindexter, informed the President. How did the White House learn about it?
I'm certain that we probably learned it from the news media, as we do many times when incidents like this occur unexpectedly.
Might this influence the decision about whether other civilians will be allowed on the shuttle from now on, Larry?
Once again, all of these questions, our immediate concern is for the fate of the crew, to find out exactly what has happened to those 7 people aboard. All of these other questions we'll just have to wait till later. Dale?
Tell us anything about what the President's schedule, how the President's schedule is changing now?
The President's schedule has not changed. He will keep on with what he had planned today and the State of the Union tonight. And once again, I think the only change in his schedule would be to simply be updated and try to seek the facts in this.
Will the President be making any phone calls to the family, Larry?
I just don't know. It customarily does, but we're going to wait till we find out what the facts are.
Larry, he watched in silence, but were there no quotes that you could give us?
Nothing. It was virtually in silence.
Are you going to know what's being done now, Larry, in terms of searching for?
No. All of that information we just do not have yet. Dale, you had one question and you want to go on? Okay.
What are your plans? What are your plans about briefing the rest of the afternoon on that?
Well, I think once we find out what the facts are, and particularly what the fate of the crew is, then we'll be prepared to say something.
Larry, did you detect any sign of emotion as the President watched? Was he shaking his head? Were his eyes moist?
Concern, anxiety, silence.
You say it's unlikely.
You've been listening to a briefing by White House spokesman Larry Speaks.
It is not known at this hour the fate of the 7 crew members aboard, including Christy McAuliffe, the school teacher from Concord, New Hampshire. The explosion came without warning. All seemed to be going fine. About a minute into that flight, it was just after the NASA controllers told the crew aboard the Challenger to go to full throttle that the explosion occurred. It happened more than a minute before the usual separation that you see of the solid fuel rocket from the main part of the Challenger. Again, paramedics and ships are moving to that area. It is not known the fate of the crew, what has happened. We hope to hear from that very shortly, but obviously it does not look good. This is the first accident of this kind for quite some years. 3 astronauts, you will recall, back in 1967 were killed on the launch pad during a testing. They burned to death inside a capsule. Again, we have no word on the fate of the 7 astronauts aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger in this accident that happened a little while ago. Let's go back now to Houston and correspondent Dan Molina. Dan?
John, I must say the President said he watched in stunned silence, as did we all. We are going to look now at a recap of what happened as narrated by the NASA commentator Steve Nesbitt.
We had an apparently nominal liftoff
shot of mission control
this morning at 11:38 Eastern Time.
A lot of muscle twitching there, as you
The
can see.
ascent phase appeared normal through approximately the completion of the roll program, and throttle down and engine throttle back to 104%. At that point, we had an apparent explosion. Subsequent to that, the tracking crews reported to the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle appeared to have exploded, and that we had an impact in the water downrange at a location approximately 28.64 degrees north, 80.28 degrees west. At the time the data was lost with the vehicle, according to a poll by the flight director Jay Green of the positions here in Mission Control, there were no anomalous indications, no indications of problems with the engines or with the SRBs or with any of the other systems at that moment through the point at which we lost data. Again, this is preliminary information. It's all that we have at the moment, and we will keep you advised as other information becomes available. There are recovery forces in the general area, others being deployed, including aircraft and ships. We saw what we believe to be paramedics parachuting into the impact area, and we have no additional word at this point.
Looking at that picture of Mission Control that you were seeing, I could notice up in the back of the room a gentleman by the name of Eugene Kranz, the Flight Operations Director. I can't help but recall when Apollo 13 had its problem. You may well recall back when Apollo 13 was in danger of not getting back from the moon. It was Eugene Kranz who sat at the flight director's desk and said, "Keep calm, we've still got the LEM, we can still make it back if we have to." There are people in that room who are used to flirting with absolute disaster, but they may have confronted one really this time.
They were killed on the pad while waiting to be launched. This morning's explosion, as you saw, happened a minute and 12 seconds about into the launch. After a series of weather and technical delays, the shuttle rose spectacularly off the launch pad this morning at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. It seemed to be climbing smoothly, trailing behind it that great blast of fire, that geyser of fire, which suddenly it erupted into a huge fireball, and the whole space shuttle apparatus shot out of control. A voice at Mission Control in Houston, perhaps you heard it on the videotape, said, "We are checking with recovery forces to see what can be done at this point." This is a replay of the videotape.
1 minute 15 seconds, velocity 2,900 feet per second, altitude 9 nautical miles, downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
That awful pray it would never happen scene of the space shuttle exploding in air. Now, on the crucial matter of the ejection seats, there are none on board Space Shuttle Challenger. There was no way in practice to make 7 ejection seats work on a shuttle. And in theory, it was thought that no one could survive an ejection from the shuttle. So in any case, we're told that there were no ejection seats on the space shuttle. Now, earlier, I said to you, and I want to explain for clarification, that there are a number of safety procedures aboard the shuttle. There are a number of procedures designed for escape from the shuttle, particularly when it's still on the launch pad. But we now know, we've sought out information and have confirmed that there were no ejection seats aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger. Now, the explosion was a devastating setback to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration after successfully carrying out 24 space shuttle missions in less than 5 years. There have been 56 U.S. man-in-space missions. That includes the whole first go into space, the moon program, the Apollo program, and the space shuttle program. But in the space shuttle program itself, there have been 24 space shuttle missions in slightly less than 5 years, increasing difficulty with these space shuttle missions in recent weeks and months. There were 7 crew members aboard. That included the school teacher, Krista McAuliffe, a 37-year-old New Hampshire school teacher who was selected as America's first citizen in space. That is, citizen not directly connected with the government. You recall that 1 senator and 1 member of the House of Representatives had been fired into space, but never a completely unconnected, if you will, civilian had attempted to be a space passenger before. Mission Control in Houston said debris from the shuttle fell several miles out in the Atlantic Ocean. Recovery forces, as we mentioned, were speeding in that direction, and we showed in the early portion of our CBS News Live report a parachute coming down in the area, and we were told later that was a paramedic who was being parachuted into the sea very near Cape Canaveral to find what that paramedic could among the debris that was beginning to fall.
4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Everything looked normal at this point, and as a matter of fact, NASA officials say there were no anomalies, nothing to indicate that anything could go wrong as it headed downrange. The Challenger has been waiting for about 5 days to go off the pad. This would have been the 6th day. A number of problems, some of them weather-related. Problems with the door yesterday, but nothing to indicate the enormity of the tragedy that we're about to see here.
Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
One minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
The NASA official who was narrating there apparently had his head down looking at telemetry, that is signals from space, because you could see quite clearly there was an explosion. It appeared to be at the back of the spacecraft. We will not know for sure, if ever. At that point, everything is burning. The solid rocket boosters on both sides, and of course the big external tank that is feeding them as well.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction. We have no downlink.
Obviously a major malfunction. That's the understatement of the year, perhaps, as this shuttle blew up as it was attempting to go into space today, about 2 minutes downrange. At one point we heard that it was 4.5 miles high at that point. There were no ejection seats whatsoever. There was no way for those astronauts to escape. There's been no confirmation on their fate, but of course it looks very much as if there was no hope whatsoever for that 7-person crew, including 2 women, and that includes the school teacher, Krista McAuliffe from Concord, New Hampshire. Her school students and other students at that school today were assembled in an auditorium to watch all of this, tragically. And of course, the teachers began to suspect that something was wrong when they saw what we all saw, and they herded the kids back into the classroom. It will be a dark memory for them.
Days, and her crewmates treat her like one of the gang. This was a little trek up to break the sound barrier with Dick Scobie, her mission commander.
They could have very easily said, oh, you know, there's a teacher, what are we going to do with her? She's going to get in the way, or we've got to plan things around her. If I needed help during the lessons, if I needed an extra pair of hands, I mean, they've just been so wonderful. I really do feel part of the crew.
For several months now, doctors have been jabbing and probing her, zipping her up in black bags to see if small dark places scare her. She's gone through all sorts of training in shuttle simulators, and she's learned a few cold, hard facts about what to expect.
I didn't realize it'd be so slippery. The shuttle's small. And if you kind of think of it as being in maybe a 6-man tent with 7 people in it, and it rains for 6 days, that's the environment that you're in.
It's all a very big change from life in Concord, New Hampshire. This was the day she left home for 4.5 months of training. It seemed especially tough to say goodbye to her daughter, Caroline.
Love you. All right. See you later, alligator.
Okay, let's get dinner ready.
Yeah.
Okay.
Life without mother in the McAuliffe household. A new adventure for Krista's husband, Steve, an attorney.
Okay. Frozen cook. Open that thing up.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
After that, no one knew what to say. On the basis of veteran space watchers, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration has said nothing about what the cause of the explosion would be. But on the basis of veteran space watchers, what the most popular hypothesis at the moment is that the explosion may have been caused by the solid rocket boosters. Again, for those of you who may have joined us late, this is a scale model of the shuttle. The shuttle sets aboard its main fuel tank here, but off to the side are the solid rocket boosters which are supposed to put it into orbit. The way this works, the solid rocket boosters are responsible for the launch and liftoff and getting into orbit. Then they're supposed to drop away once they have expended their solid rocket fuel, and then the shuttle, piggybacking on its main fuel tank, goes on up into orbit and eventually is always in the past is separated from its main fuel tank and then is in orbit and out there to do its work. The hypothesis at the moment, one of the theories is that because this happened 1 minute and 12 seconds into launch while the solid rocket boosters were supposedly still doing their job, that the explosion may have been caused by something malfunctioning having to do with the solid rocket boosters. Now, Bruce Hall is at Cape Canaveral, Florida. The 7 crew members had breakfast, of course, this morning before their scheduled liftoff, and Bruce is with us at Cape Canaveral. Bruce?
Dan, we still have no official word from the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. The crew got up for breakfast. They were allowed to sleep a little late this morning because there was a problem at the launch pad. A faulty gauge first caused a delay of about an hour, so the crew had an extra hour's rest today. Some of the crew had already admitted they were a little frustrated by all the delays. We've had a considerable amount of weather delays and had a problem with the door yesterday, in that they could not get the door properly closed on the Space Shuttle.
But again, 3 Coast Guard cutters and 2 rescue helicopters. And a little bit earlier, we saw that parachute in the sky. That was one of the paramedics bailing out there over the scene. Again, as Tom said, and as we have heard several times now, the explosion took place about 1 minute or 1 minute and 15 seconds to be exact into the flight. All appeared to be going well. And then there was that tremendous, brilliant flash, the explosion. And we had 2 contrails, one going one way and one the other. One apparently the solid rocket dropping into the sea, the other the Space Shuttle Challenger. Earlier this morning, the delays were caused by the freezing conditions down in Florida. There were icicles, some people said as long as 2 feet, hanging from parts of the spacecraft, and there was a condensation problem, and they were a little bit afraid, and they delayed because this, they thought, might cause a problem of chipping of some of those sensitive tiles on the spacecraft if they should break off during the launch procedure. Well, the NASA officials talked this over for some time and decided to go ahead with the launch, that they didn't think that would cause any particular problem. Here is a picture of the crew, the 7 astronauts aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger. Of course, the most celebrated passenger there is the civilian, if you will, the school teacher, Krista McAuliffe of Concord, New Hampshire. And there were a lot of reporters were up there this afternoon, of course, for the launch. They were in the high school auditorium with the students as they watched their teacher take off. And then, of course, as all of us that were watching noticed that there was something wrong, there was an explosion. The school officials didn't know what had happened, but they knew something had happened, and they suggested that all the reporters leave and all the students go back to their classes, and that's what happened. There is Krista McAuliffe, the school teacher, who is taking her flight. She was going to conduct 2 one-hour or so classrooms from space and be talking back to kids in classrooms all over the United States. The other crew members aboard that flight, along with Krista McAuliffe, the commander was Francis R. Scobie, 46 years old. The pilot was Michael J. Smith, age 40. Judith Resnick, also on board, age 36. Ronald E. McNair, 35. Ellison Onizuka, who was 39. And Gregory Jarva, who was 41. That's Gregory Jarvis, 41. All in all, 7 astronauts aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger. And again, Tom, we're just waiting here, as you are, for some word as to the fate of those aboard the Space Shuttle.
Thank you very much, John. I can talk at some length about Judy Resnick, one of the astronauts that was aboard this ill-fated shuttle this morning. She was one of the first astronauts assigned to NBC News when we first began covering this program. She was a determined and enthusiastic young physicist who maintained her enthusiasm for the space program even through some long delays. As a matter of fact, I had a note from her recently inviting me to come down and watch this launch because we've had a kind of a running joke about the delays in the Shuttle Challenger and in the shuttle program. Judy lives in Houston, Texas. She's given over her life to the space program, and it appears today that she may have, in fact, given her life to the space program. She was one of those people who worked in anonymity, really. She was not the first woman to go into space. That was Sally Ride, but Judy Resnick was right behind her, and she's a payload specialist. She has been living in Houston outside the Space Center now for about the past 10 years, going to work on what is a really trying routine for these people who are involved in the space program. It's not all the glamour of the launch day. Long hours, sometimes 7 days a week, training in programs for which we may not think as civilians that there will be any payoff, but they know that ultimately that they will learn from it. So it's an enormous tragedy for all the families of all the astronauts who are involved, not just the McAuliffe family. Dan Molina now is at Houston. Do we know any more down there, Dan, at the Johnson Space Center?
Tom, we're just getting a little bit more information. We are told that there is a recovery force in the area. They are correcting the distance that Challenger was downrange when it exploded. They are saying it was 18 miles downrange now. They are saying that there was no, quote, anomalous information coming into Mission Control at the time that the explosion occurred. That, of course, translates to nothing wrong, apparently. It occurred the explosion, that is, occurred shortly after what is known as throttle up to 104%. They throttle up the engines to 104% of their capacity. That is a normal procedure during launch. And it was at that point that the explosion occurred. Mission Control here in Houston has complete control of the launch sequence from the point where the shuttle clears the tower, which is about 7 seconds into launch. So all of the information, all of the telemetry comes into here at the Johnson Space Center. They are studying it now. They are telling us nothing more than they couldn't see anything wrong at the time. Obviously, a complete evaluation going on here and at headquarters in Washington, D.C. Aside from that, Tom, we have no further information for you now.
I think it might be useful if we showed a NASA animation of what is supposed to happen under normal circumstances now. During a routine separation, what happens is that those 2 large rockets on either side of the shuttle slide away from it. And the big external tank, which is now orange-colored at the back of it, that just breaks up. What is supposed to happen is that those 2 external rockets slide away, and the big external tank breaks up, and then, of course, the shuttle itself goes into orbit. It's really a flying airplane with 2 short wings on it. Let us show you now a NASA animation of what is supposed to happen on a normal launch. And then the external tank will separate and it will break up. That external tank is filled with a combination of oxygen and hydrogen. It fuels the main engines, which are at the very bottom of the spacecraft itself. They're used for liftoff and then for directional purposes during the course of the flight. And then, of course, they're used once again as they re-enter the Earth's atmosphere for the landing either at Cape Canaveral or sometimes at California at Edwards Air Force Base. At the Jet Propulsion Laboratory today in Pasadena, California, NBC News space correspondent Roy Neal, who has watched a lot of these, and he has watched a lot of, or too many tragedies over the years as well. Roy?
Let me first of all say that NASA had planned on everything except what happened this morning. As you know, they had abort modes, 4 of them, which would handle almost every situation, including, an escape chute down which they could ride off the launch pad. But this, whatever it was, this catastrophic failure was not in the NASA plan. And what it means to most of the experienced reporters here who have been covering this beat and who are here in Pasadena because we've been observing Voyager passing by Uranus. What it means to most of the reporters here is NASA now has to go back to its drawing board. First, it has to find out what happened, and after that, in addition to finding out what happened, what do they do to fix it? The only time before in the whole history of the space program that astronauts have ever been killed in the line of duty was back on what they call Apollo 1. And at that time, the spacecraft was on the launch pad. It was an early version of the Apollo spacecraft, which called for a total redesign. Now, obviously, the space shuttle, having flown a number of times and flown very well, experienced something strange, something that caused catastrophe. Among the reporters here, there was a mood, it was incredible. They were gathered for a news conference that should be taking place in about a half hour, a climatic news conference that should have covered all the wonderful things that an unmanned probe had discovered in deep space, out at a far planet. Instead, as they watched in utter amazement on their monitors, the reporters saw instead catastrophe at the Cape, an explosion the size of a small nuclear weapon, we are told, because that's about the explosive capability of the external fuel tank when it blows. A small nuclear weapon, in space, of course, actually in atmosphere, but high enough that no one was there to observe it, enough miles from the Cape that they could see it, but not feel the power of that detonation. There was one chute that was seen, but the observers also know there were no chutes for the crew. No chutes, no escape tower, no way out for this kind of failure. Instead, the only chutes on board were to bring down the solid rocket boosters. And one of them did indeed deploy, and presumably there's a solid rocket booster somewhat burned out somewhere out there in the Atlantic Ocean. But as far as the crew is concerned at this writing, it would seem totally hopeless, and NASA obviously has suffered a tremendous tragedy with the catastrophic failure today. Tom?
Right, wouldn't you think that the shuttle program now is just going to be on hold for an undetermined number of months? They've had a number of difficulties with the launch of this vehicle before today because of
change in many of the places around the country. We're going to run again the liftoff of the Challenger as it took off from Cape Canaveral this morning. John Quinones described it to us from the Cape just a few moments ago as perfectly normal in every respect. You'll recall it had been delayed yesterday because of high weather, and it had been delayed the day before because they couldn't get a screw fully tightened down on one of the hatches. But for those of you around the country who may just be joining us now for the first time and may not have heard the news, or perhaps not have seen it, here again is the liftoff of the shuttle from the Cape this morning. That is not the liftoff, that is the subsequent tragic result as something blows up about 7 to 10 miles above the Atlantic Ocean across the Cape. I must tell you, Steve, having now seen that 4 or 5 times, that great ball of fire looks to me like it may be one of the solid rocket boosters.
The enormous power, 2.5 million pounds of thrust, that is all a part of that launch that we have come to take so for granted. And that, of course, was the mix that we just saw exploding once again in that replay of what took place at shortly after 11:39 launch time, Eastern time this morning. The Space Shuttle Challenger with its crew of 7. We do not have any official word yet on the fate of the 7 crew members. 2 women actually aboard, Krista McAuliffe.
The liftoff this morning. We do have photographs of the crew, pictures taken this morning of the crew before the liftoff from the launch pad. As Bruce said, the crew was allowed to sleep in a little later this morning because there was anticipated some delays in the preparation. If we have those on videotape now, perhaps we can and should take a look at them. Well, we may not have them available just at this moment. No, here they are.
This is Krista McAuliffe, live from the Challenger.
This excited, nervous school teacher is polishing the lesson she will teach from outer space.
Here, so I can explain to the kids that everything has to be held down because otherwise...
School children from all over the country will tune in on public television. Quite a change from a year ago, when our biggest audience was the social studies class at Concord High School in New Hampshire. McAuliffe became one of America's best-known teachers when she was picked from more than 11,000 applicants to be the first private citizen to get a ride on the shuttle.
I thought there was never going to be any more excitement. I mean, I could never peak any higher than I had on July 19th, and it just keeps building.
Gordon McCrae, who starred in the movie musicals Oklahoma and Carousel, died today in Lincoln, Nebraska. He'd been suffering from cancer and pneumonia. McCrae starred in radio and television, but he may be best remembered as Curly, the love-struck cowboy of Oklahoma.
Oh, what a beautiful morning. Oh.
The Challenger was to enter a period of peak aerodynamic pressure, when wind and other conditions would be exerting the maximum force on the shuttle, and when they were about to throttle up again to full power on the engines. Recovery vehicles off the coast of Florida apparently spotted debris. They were delayed getting into the area they wanted to reach because of some of the debris, but so far no word of any survivors. And to note again, this particular shuttle was not equipped with any ejection seats. Bill Plant is standing by at the White House to recap for us what has happened this morning. But before we go to Bill Plant, let me again make use of our scale model here, so we get the best understanding that we possibly can of what you see when we show you the videotape of the launch and the explosion in air. This is the configuration scale.
Pair of cow's horns, each curving in a different direction. Nobody was quite sure what we were looking at that point.
Yeah, Steve.
Except it was very clear that something was awfully wrong.
Yeah, the only thing that looked to be intact to my naked eye, at least, was one of the solid rocket boosters that seemed to be going off in one direction. But everything else seemed to have been virtually destroyed by the magnitude of that explosion at what appeared to be the base of the rocket. Of course, it's back there that the main engines are located.
Well, that's where all the energy was being burned, and I think I heard somebody from the mission control in Houston say a few minutes ago that it was just after the 3 main engines to burn that this happened, and absolutely without warning. There was no anomaly, as they say. There was no indication here or from the things that the controllers were saying that anything was happening other than a great, dramatic, beautiful liftoff, as we've seen so many times before.
Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on there right now in terms of the crowd? Are people sticking around? It's always a big attraction in Florida, of course, but a tragedy of this scope. Are people staying around to hear what the final answer is, or are they just drifting away, Steve?
Well, as usually happens, there was a tremendous number in the yellow tent back there that you may be able to see. There's a VIP section. There were 8 or 10 busloads of people who had been invited here to watch this. Some of them were educators, some of them were people with a special interest in either the hardware they were carrying along or something else. As soon as this happened, of course, we all got so busy that we didn't really notice what happened to them, but they're not here. Reporters began to scuttle around in various directions, trying to first of all comprehend what had happened, and then see what if anything, we could do to help other people understand what was going on.
Steve and Tom.
What happened to the spectators, I don't know.
Okay. Yes, John Palmer, New York.
Yeah, we're hearing now from NASA. They say that the rescue teams are just now being allowed to enter the impact zone, and the new coordinates we have of the impact zone here are 10.4 miles uprange, 8 miles out over the ocean, where the impact occurred. They say they're just now being allowed into the area because for some minutes after the impact, there was a lot of debris. Some of it we saw there in that replay of the explosion falling out of the sky, and it would be just too dangerous to get into that particular area. But again, of course, we have no word on the fate of the crew, but it doesn't look very good.
There were, what, 3 Coast Guard cutters, John, I'm told, and 2 helicopters in that area.
That's right.
And they're just now, it's about 1 hour after the explosion, 1 hour and a couple of minutes maybe, that they're finally able to enter that area. But as you say, debris continues to fall into the ocean there. There's been no indication whatsoever from NASA of any sign of life. We continue to point out to you. We have no confirmation, of course, that the 7-person crew was killed. But the fact of the matter is, if you looked at those pictures as we did, it seemed that no one could possibly survive that. Fred Francis is at the Defense Department this morning. And Fred, what do they have out there in terms of rescue vehicles and rescue ships?
Well, Tom, this has become so routine that they just had 3 Coast Guard cutters out there this morning, only one assigned to actually patrol up and down and keep spectators away from the launch area just off the coast. But of course, as soon as it happened, the United States Navy began moving its ships, and right now we're told that a U.S. Navy hydrofoil, the USS Pegasus, is about 30 minutes from the scene and heading full speed in that direction, along with the U.S. Navy frigate, the USS Underwood, and that's about an hour and 20 minutes away. But Tom, I must tell you that within seconds of watching that explosion here at the Pentagon with several Air Force officers, they did not know what happened, but they were very certain that the devastation of the explosion, one man said, nobody survived that. So what they're going to do now is actually look for pieces, pick up all the pieces that are possible in that area. And as we saw it shower down, it's going to be quite a wide area of picking up debris.
Yeah, Fred, also the shuttle, of course, has military applications. The United States military has hoped to use it for a variety of mostly classified purposes thus far. My guess is that this will put everything on hold in terms of the shuttle program, not just for civilian purposes, but for military purposes as well. As you were talking with those Air Force officers, do they have any thoughts on that?
Well, that has been a long-running controversy here at the Pentagon. Many in the Air Force want to have the expendable launch vehicles used without the shuttle to put into orbit reconnaissance satellites and communication satellites. They don't feel, and they've not felt for a long time, that the shuttle has been reliable enough to put up those time-urgent satellites that the United States so depends on. And of course, this will fuel that controversy. Many in the Air Force will say we have to go to the expendable vehicles. We must put our satellites in the air apart from NASA. And that will hurt NASA, of course, not just from a tragedy like this, because NASA depends so much on millions and millions of dollars given to it by the Air Force for launching those satellites.
Fred, right now we're looking at live NASA pictures out over the Cape. This is the ocean just off the coast of Florida. That's near Cocoa Beach, Florida. It's a familiar sight, of course. The Kennedy Space Center located at Cape Canaveral. A sparkling, clear day. It's been cold in Florida.
Tom, interesting, Tom, that we usually have a Soviet trawler or some sort of Soviet spy ship off the coast of Cape Canaveral for almost every one of these launches, and perhaps they've become so routine for them as well that on this day, the United States Navy says there are no Soviet vessels in the area.
Well, those clear blue skies and that sparkling ocean are quite a contrast, of course, to the tragedy that we are describing for you today. The blow-up of the Shuttle Challenger about 2 minutes after it left the launch pad at Cape Canaveral with 7 people on board, including schoolteacher Krista McAuliffe. Robert Brazell, NBC News chief science correspondent, is at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, where he was preparing a report on the Voyager spacecraft. The Voyager, of course, has been taking pictures of the Uranus moons and other objects in outer space. That had hoped to be a triumph report today. Instead, we're dealing with this tragedy. Bob, do you think that NASA just went too far in terms of its public relations efforts by putting a teacher on board after putting a couple of congressional people in what, under almost any circumstances, is a pretty high-risk situation?
It certainly is. In fact, I think I could inject a personal note here, because the commander of that mission, Francis Scobie, who was known as Dick Scobie, as you remember, Tom, on the earlier space missions, we always had an astronaut who was our advisor, and Dick Scobie was one on the first mission where Sally Ride flew, so he was with us for a long time, and I got to know the man very well. And I remember one night we were driving back from the launch pad, and he said to me that someday one of these things is going to blow up. I remember this conversation very well. He said, it's a very complex piece of machinery. It has a lot of explosives on it. He said, someday, like there's bound to be airplane crashes, he said, someday one of these is going to blow up. And he said, I certainly hope that when that happens, it won't end the space shuttle program or put it in jeopardy. Now, that was what he said. I remember it very clearly now. But, of course, I think that his prediction won't be true. I think that this is going to cause, of course, a very long delay, if not an abandonment of manned spaceflight for a while, because in terms of the public relations effort, of course, it couldn't have been worse, but just in terms of trying to understand what happened, is it worth it to put people in space? Because there's been a lot of criticism in Congress to say that most of the things that are being done by these people could, in fact, be done by robots, and this may lead to a lot more thinking in that direction.
Yeah, well, my guess is, Bob, that there will be no more civilians in space for a long, long time in the shuttle program, and that the program itself will be delayed, but the United States investment is so considerable, and there is potential there that they will be able to reactivate the program down the road a ways, but certainly they're going to have to work out the problems that they've been having recently with these delayed launches, and then today, this enormous tragedy. We have a report here that top NASA officials have told Representative Manuel Lujan of New Mexico that it doesn't look like any lives were saved when the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded today. A congressional aide reporting that. Steve Goldstein, who was Lujan's aide, said that Dr. William Graham, the NASA administrator, and his legislative assistant Jack Murphy were meeting with Lujan on Capitol Hill to discuss the agency's budget at the time of liftoff at about 11:38 this morning, and then he was told that it doesn't look like any of the lives were saved. Of course, this was stunning to people in Congress as well. There was a moment of silent prayer. The House immediately adjourned for about 2 hours. A terrible thing, a terrible thing. Those are the words of House Speaker Thomas P. Tip O'Neill. Now let's go to Capitol Hill for the reaction from there. John Dancy.
Tom, I'm in the Senate press gallery at the moment. As you can imagine, a number of television crews are assembling here, starting to set up their equipment, because this is the place that one of the first reactions will be felt here on Capitol Hill. Because
rate of speed down towards the ocean. You've seen that sequence. Have you any thought what that might be? The close-up shot, you've seen it?
Well, again, it might very well be, if it looks like there's any kind of thrust or fire coming out of it, I would assume it might very well be one of those solid rocket boosters without any direction, and no computer telling it where to go, and of course gravity's taking over and it's just pointing down toward here.
Officer that the vehicle has exploded. Flight director confirms that. We are looking at...
But it appears, you know, again, it's so difficult to speculate in a case like this, Peter, but it appears to me that the explosion occurred within obviously the propellant area, or the shuttle and the external tank itself, and not in the solid rocket boosters. Solid rocket boosters are inherently safe. They either work and burn till extinction, or they don't work at all.
Gene, it is unfair of me to even ask you to speculate, so I will ask you for the moment if you wouldn't mind staying with us on the telephone. God, Steve, we've got people who are much better at these models than you and me. But
I have you now on television, Peter, so I'm watching what you're doing.
Well, Gene, I hope I don't make any mistakes in trying to explain to people the basics of what may have happened here. Here is the shuttle itself. Here is Challenger. It lifted off from the ground, as you know, in a position like this, and was beginning to angle its way into orbit, going not only upwards, but going downrange. And these two solid rocket boosters, these solid rocket fuels, are the ones that you always see burning so brightly. At some point, about 2 minutes and 10 seconds into the mission, just about the time we saw the explosion this morning, being a normal occurrence, these two rockets fall away, and the main engine continues to push the Challenger towards its orbit above the Earth. Now, as best we can tell by looking at the pictures, it is in here where the problem appears to have occurred.
It appears, Peter, that those solid rocket motors were still firing and attached as they were supposed to be, and that, you know...
Gene, can you see the picture now?
Yes, I surely can.
Tell us about all this.
Well, you know, in order to make the shuttle itself, the space plane, as you're looking at it there, as light as possible and able to withstand the heat of reentry and then land on a runway, it was decided long ago to put the fuel external to the shuttle itself. So the shuttle basically has no fuel in it at all to get it in orbit. It has fuel to fire little rocket engines to control it once it's in orbit, but it would carry the fuel externally on the big tank that is very obvious there in front of you. And that tank would be jettisoned just when the fuel was almost burned out, just before the shuttle went into orbit, but the shuttle indeed would have just about the right velocity to itself go on in orbit, where the tank would then break up, and it was the one thing that was not recoverable. It would break up and burn up in the atmosphere.
So, Gene, you're saying that there has not been in the shuttle program any provision made for the danger here for crew to break away in any way, shape, or form?
Well, yes, there was. As I say, if you could recognize danger, apparently this morning it came about so quickly, everybody on the ground, from what I can hear and understand, and certainly everybody in the spacecraft, did not anticipate any problem. But if there had been a problem, what would have been done is the shuttle, indeed, the space plane as you see it there, would have broken away from the external tank and the solid rocket boosters, and itself come back to land at Kennedy Space Center just like it normally comes in during reentry. And it could have indeed come in and landed had we recognized that there was a problem forthcoming. But the suddenness, the catastrophic, you know, we saw it, and we heard the people talking within seconds of that explosion. Nobody had any idea, obviously, that there was something amiss. Now, that big tank, remember, is carrying nothing but liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, which are two of the the highest performance propellants, and that's why we use them for their weight. We've used them in the space program for many, many years. Very explosive, but very reliable when they're in control. And at that moment we see where, you know, it's almost like someone broke the barrier between the liquid hydrogen and the liquid oxygen in that tank, and they completely immerse themselves in each other and instantaneously explode.
That's a booster there, isn't it, Gene?
That's a booster. That is one of the solid boosters without guidance, obviously just heading a miss. And it's going to just, there appears to be both solid boosters are broken away and don't know where they're going, but there is no signal to shut them down, and indeed they were not designed to be shut down because there was no need to anyway.
Gene, stand by for just a second, would you? And we're very grateful for your explanation about this extraordinarily sad accident in which, in case you have just joined us, 7 people are reported missing at this point, the 7 astronauts on board. Steve?
Peter, we have the reaction from Vice President Bush, who has spoken with reporters. Let's listen.
No more than anyone else knows.
How was the reaction?
Terrible tragedy. Well, just enormous tragedy, and
what does this mean for the space shuttle?
great concern for the families of people. A horrible feeling on all of that. Well, I think it's way too early to know that.
The evidence that they can find or the possibility of any survivors. These are the first pictures that we've been able to see from the recovery scene just a few miles off the Kennedy Space Center. It appears from looking at this that these are relatively small pieces. This is a very large, the shuttle is very large along with the solid rocket boosters. And what we are able to see in the ocean itself appear to be quite small pieces, relatively speaking. Somewhat similar to what you have seen as the results of a number of plane crashes, when there has been an explosion and there's just very little left.
We do want to point out that these are live pictures from the recovery area, which is a short distance east of the United States mainland off Florida. Since the explosion aboard Space Shuttle Challenger happened this morning, only 1 minute and 12 seconds into flight, and given the size, the huge fireball, one is not surprised to see so little debris in the water there. Bruce, it may be worth that we've had some questions. Clearly anything as complicated as one of these space shuttle launches about what could have happened there. Perhaps what we should do is again talk about at what stage the Space Shuttle Challenger this morning was in during the launch and the liftoff, and what appears to have happened. Now, what we will try to do is, do you have a model there, Bruce, or not?
Dan, I do not have a model here in front of me. I think I'll have one here in a couple of minutes. The
help me as we go.
Have been using has been very good in the way that you have been explaining it. And connected with that, the stop-action videotape that you have been looking at, you can actually see the point of where the explosion occurred. Now, there are several possibilities here, and you must realize that NASA has made no announcement at all. But for those people who have viewed a number of these flights, there are several things come to mind immediately. At the point in the flight when the explosion took place, there was 250,000 gallons a second of superfluids, liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, flowing to the engines. And it was during that point, approximately 1 minute 12 into the flight, that it appeared from the stop-action videotape that a small explosion occurred, a very small one, and then a major explosion in the main tank. This is the tank where all of the fuel is stored. This is a tank that is not reusable. It normally drops off over the Indian Ocean. But this was completely full at the time. And when that main explosion, that is the fireball that you saw. It is that main tank exploding. It appeared to us here, those of us who were looking at the videotape that you were showing, there was a very small, just a second or maybe even a millisecond prior to the main explosion, a smaller ignition or a little explosion in the solid rocket booster, as you indicated earlier. But it is a time when they're at full thrust, 104% thrust they call it here. It is the time during the shuttle mission when there is the most power during the entire flight. And after they get into orbit and the solid rocket boosters fall away at just after 2 minutes into the flight, then they throttle back to 60% of thrust. But at the time the explosion occurred, it was the time when the thrust was at the strongest point of any time during a shuttle trip.
Just to underscore that, Bruce, and we've been trying to explain as best we can as we go along what appears to have happened this morning. We're going to do three things. We're going to review what the procedure is, where the engines are, and where the thrust comes from. Then we're going to show you the real-time videotape of the launch this morning, and then the explosion a minute and 12 seconds into launch. Then we're going to stop and show you in slow motion some of just what Bruce Hall was talking about. Now, to review what Bruce said with our model here, and forgive me, I'm not an expert on spacecraft, and if the explanation seems a little awkward, I know that you will understand that. But we want you to understand how the shuttle works, review that for you, and so you can have a better understanding of what happened this morning. The shuttle, again, it has its own 3 engines back here, right down at the base of the shuttle. The shuttle has its own 3 engines. Now, those 3 engines go off of liquid hydrogen fuel. These 3 main engines operate off liquid hydrogen fuel. Liquid oxygen and explosive liquid hydrogen fuel feed these 3 engines. But these 3 engines built into the spacecraft itself are not enough to get it off the launch pad. So they have these solid rocket fuel engines built onto the side. Component parts, solid rocket fuel engines. You know, the kind of rockets that the Germans made such good use of in the one stage of World War II. But that's solid fuel in these rockets. And these rockets have tremendous thrust, and that helps get this whole, the space shuttle itself, its main liquid oxygen and explosive liquid hydrogen tank that it rides piggyback on, helps these liquid solid fuel rockets help get the whole thing off the pad. The little engines, comparatively small engines, in the tail of the space shuttle not being enough to get it off the pad and head it toward orbit. Now the plan, and what happens and what has always happened before, once it gets off the pad, once it gets headed toward orbit and the solid rocket boosters have done their job, then they are to fall away. You've seen that happen so many times on our videotape with previous shots. That leaves the space shuttle riding piggyback on the source of its liquid fuel, the liquid oxygen and the explosive liquid hydrogen fuel in here. Now, what happened this morning, all of these component parts were still together as they should have been. After the liftoff, they're still together. And what you're going to see as we go through the real-time videotape replay and the slow motion is that it appears that the first explosion is on the right-hand side of one of these liquid, or one of the solid rocket boosters. Now let's go to the real-time videotape replay first and then the slow motion.
4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now control program. Roger, roll, Challenger. Good, roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading down range. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up. One minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
The explosion has occurred. Mission control on Houston at this moment, this morning, just after the explosion, simply didn't know what had happened. Smoke trails, debris begins to fall.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
Obviously a major malfunction, meaning a catastrophe in the sky as Space Challenger sought to explore the high frontier. Now let's take a look at what happened at the critical moments in slow motion. All of the Space Shuttle and Challenger, its fuel tank and the solid rocket boosters intact. We're about 3/4 a minute into it. Now, stop right there. You can see the first explosion appears to happen at the right side of one of those solid rocket boosters. And then the liquid fuel, liquid oxygen and highly explosive liquid hydrogen fuel on which the Space Shuttle is riding also goes up and creates the fireball. That a slow motion replay of the videotape, and if we can go again now live to the recovery area, if we still have that capacity, the search for debris and survivors, this is the scene. This is a live shot from on board a NASA aircraft in the area. Very little debris spotted. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration still has no explanation, has put forward not even any theories as to what it believes may have happened this morning. Bruce Hall mentioned that many veteran observers put forward the hypothesis, nothing more than that, that because of the deep freeze in Florida, unusual for Florida, the deep freeze this morning, that some icicles could have been, may have been, possibly have been created, and that one theory, nothing more than that, is that the icicles could have in some way been knocked off the Space Shuttle as it was going up and was knocked into the explosive fuel on which the shuttle was riding. We're told that First Lady Nancy Reagan was watching the launch alone in the White House this morning in the family quarters, and that she exclaimed, "Oh my God, no," when she saw that fireball that we showed you. David Martin, our Pentagon correspondent, is at the Defense Department at the moment with details about the recovery operation. David?
Dan, the recovery operation is being run by the Coast Guard, which had two cutters in the area at the time. There were no U.S. Navy ships in the immediate area. You have the two Coast Guard cutters, a third cutter that is close to the area, all three of them.
She said that she would start praying for some thread of hope. Tragically as well, not only were 1,200 students of Concord High School, where Mrs. McAuliffe taught, watching this on television today, but at the Cape itself, her family was assembled. Her husband Stephen and two small children, a boy and a girl. Young Scott and Caroline were there watching too. That, I believe, is her mother and father. They appear not to know quite what's going wrong. Now, the realization. McAuliffe's parents watching today at Cape Canaveral. You could hear the NASA commentator in the background say there's a major malfunction. Now I think it is beginning to dawn on them that something terribly is wrong. You can hear another NASA official in the background saying, let's get out of this area. At the Senate press gallery, Senator Jake Garn, the first civilian to go up in the Space Shuttle, talking to reporters now. Let's go there.
All right. Reaction to what happened today?
Well, it's very difficult for me to talk about it because these were my friends. Mike Smith, the pilot, was my mother hen the first month that I trained. They assigned him to me, go to my classes and help brief me. And I don't know of any time that I have been more shocked or more moved than when my first wife was killed in an automobile accident. And so it's been very, very difficult for me this morning.
What does this do to the space program here and its support on the Hill, Senator?
Well, I have great confidence in the space program. I think it's a remarkable system, and I think we should push ahead after we have determined the cause. Obviously, we should not fly until we have determined the cause of this particular failure. But I think we need to look at all of the successes, the remarkable safety record that the space program has had, the benefits that come from it, and the crew members that I knew so well. I would expect that they would want us to go ahead with the space program after we have gone through the proper investigations and analysis and know what happened.
Showing how the launch should have gone. At 2 minutes into the flight, the shuttle's two boosters, the solid rocket boosters, should separate from the spacecraft itself. That would be 2 minutes in. The spacecraft never got to that point. The boosters would plunge into the ocean after they'd done their job of helping get the spaceship into, headed toward orbit, and they'd be retrieved for further use, those solid rocket boosters. And now that's how today's launch of Space Shuttle Challenger should have gone. Instead, this is what happens, or appears to have happened. At less than 2 minutes into the flight, at about 1 minute and 12 seconds, there was an explosion. After what seemed to be an ordinary launch. The explosion seems to be on the right side of one of those solid launch boosters, solid rocket fuel boosters. Pieces of the 100-ton spacecraft began to come down into the water about 28 miles downrange from the launch site. The first explosion seemed to be in one of the solid rocket fuel boosters. The next explosion consumed the liquid fuel on which the space shuttle rides and consumed the whole space shuttle, the solid rocket boosters, the liquid fuel tank, and the space shuttle itself. Bruce Hall at Cape Canaveral now has more on what may have happened to the engines. Bruce?
Dan, we have been operating on the theory, although we have heard absolutely nothing from NASA about this, but the first people who were reviewing the tape, just as you have been saying, it appeared there was a possible small explosion or some type of ignition in the solid rocket booster, and then there was a major explosion in the main tank. Now people have had the opportunity to review these tapes, to look at the slow motion as we have been doing. A second theory, and I must emphasize, Dan, this is only a theory. A second theory is coming to the forefront now, and that is that an explosion took place first in the main engine tank, and it occurred right at the seam, at the point where the orbiter, the Space Shuttle Challenger, is attached to the main fuel tank. I now have a small model here with me, nothing like the larger one that you have, but if you can see right in at the very point on this tank, if you can hold it, it's about to fall on this, but there is a place where the Shuttle Challenger is attached to the main tank. It is the theory here, among others, that it very well could have been a seam on the main tank. These are not reusable tanks like the solid rocket boosters. These are used once and are ejected over the Indian Ocean and go into the ocean. But the theory is a possibility that there was a rupture right along the seam next to the point where the Space Shuttle Challenger is attached to the main tank. The orbiter is attached at that point, and this was a point during maximum thrust, if you will recall. This is the point in the mission where you have absolute full thrust, and the last words that we heard from the Space Shuttle said, "Roger, go to throttle up." That's go to throttle up. That is to go to maximum thrust. And within a second or two after that point, it is when it appears the explosion took place. Now, I must emphasize again, Dan, these are only theories. We have not heard anything from NASA. These are the theories of people who are looking at the tapes here, and they are also looking in slow motion, trying to make some determination. I'm sure that we will have further definitive word from NASA later on. One thing I do want to mention in regard to the crew, we've talked about the 7 astronauts. This crew was one that they were particularly interested because of the Krista McAuliffe going along with them. The commander of the crew, Dick Scobie's wife, is a prominent educator, and she was extremely proud by the fact that a teacher was going on this particular flight. It was also a flight that Greg Jarvis was very happy to be on. Greg Jarvis is a person who had been bumped from 2 flights. He had been bumped from the flight which Senator Jake Garn went on. He was later bumped from the flight which Congressman Bill Nelson went on. So this was a man who twice had been bumped from flights. He was extremely excited about going into this. He was very confident. He was comfortable. And during this
all space flights of the shuttle until he finds out what happened. He said, I do have confidence in the people running the program. This is the first fatal accident in 56 flights. Obviously, we want to find out what happened, and so that it won't happen again, and I'm sure that there will be no more flights until the flight controllers are absolutely certain of what went wrong and how to repair it. He said, you know, in the past, some of us have gotten a bit impatient with all of the holes in these flights and wondered whether perhaps the flight controllers were a little overzealous, a little too careful. He said, today we tragically found out that, no, that we do need those precautions. As to the fact that a private citizen, Krista McAuliffe, the teacher from New Hampshire, was on board this flight, he said, look, all 7 of those people are citizens. All 7 of them were volunteers. No one goes on that space flight who wasn't very much interested and very much desirous of getting a coveted seat on the shuttle. He said that the space program is basically the last frontier. I guess we have become so confident that things would go right that it comes as an especially great shock when suddenly something goes so terribly wrong. He said that he will go ahead with a State of the Union message tonight saying that things like that have to go on. We have to go on governing the nation, but he said that obviously there will be a reference to this tragedy during his speech tonight to a joint session of Congress. As for any backlash against the space shuttle, he said no, accidents happen in every line of transportation, and obviously up till now the space shuttle's safety record was perfect. As to who brought him the news, he said that he was in the Oval Office preparing for a background briefing he was going to have with reporters when Vice President Bush and National Security Advisor John Poindexter came in and handed him a note saying that the space shuttle had exploded, no further details. Then the President, Bush, and Poindexter all went to a small study that the President has just off the Oval Office, and like everybody else, turned on their TV to see what was happening, watched, to their horror, tape replays of the explosion. He called it a, quote, very traumatic experience. He said that this will indeed cast a pall on his speech tonight, which he had hoped to use as an opportunity to push his program for the next legislative year. But he said that while they will mention it, you have to go on governing the nation. As for Krista McAuliffe, and there was a certain bitter irony in this because Krista McAuliffe was named to the space program several months ago in the Roosevelt Room, the room where we were all with the President, and at that time it was, of course, a great source of pride to Mr. Reagan, who had come up with the idea of putting a teacher in space. He said that I can't get out of my mind the thought of her husband and her children who were watching as the shuttle exploded. He said, of course, all the other families, many of them were also there, but they, as test pilots, the families of test pilots were more aware of the dangers of this program. He said, knowing that they were there and watching, your heart goes out to them. One other footnote, Tom, we have been told that Mrs. Reagan was upstairs in the family quarters alone and just happened to have the TV set on and was watching live when the flight lifted off and said, oh my God, no, and was very upset when she saw live the terrible tragedy.
Thank you. Chris Wallace of the White House today. And as he indicated, the State of the Union address will go on tonight as scheduled before a joint session of Congress at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. NBC News will have coverage of that, and we'll have continuing coverage all day long here of this enormous tragedy involving the Space Shuttle Challenger. All 7 crew members on board, including the school teacher, Krista McAuliffe, appeared to have perished in a giant explosion that occurred 2 minutes after liftoff today, about 18 miles downrange, about 5 miles up in the air. There are recovery crews now in the area, but so far no word from them. They couldn't even enter the area for a time because there was so much debris falling. The most arresting pictures so far today, in addition to the explosion itself, occurred at the Cape, where Krista McAuliffe's husband and her 2 children were watching, along with her parents, Ed and Grace Corrigan of Framingham, Massachusetts. They stood silently during the launch, not entirely sure of what they were seeing, I'm confident. They remained standing together as the loudspeaker brought that chilling announcement. There appears to have been a major malfunction. The vehicle has exploded, it was then, they were then told, and Mrs. Corrigan, that is Krista McAuliffe's mother, looked at the NASA official and repeated his words as a question. The vehicle has exploded.
Tom?
This was to have been a triumphant day, of course, for Krista McAuliffe. She was selected by this administration as the first school teacher to go in space, and Dan Molina now remembers a happier time when, in fact, that selection was made.
The 10 finalists, all the testing, training, and dreaming was over. It all came down to this one moment in the White House. First, Vice President Bush announced the backup for the flight, Barbara Morgan of McCall, Idaho. Then, for 36-year-old Sharon Krista McAuliffe of Concord, New Hampshire, the dream came true.
It's not often that a teacher is at a loss for words. I know my students wouldn't think so. I've made 9 wonderful friends over the last 2 weeks. And when that shuttle goes, they might be one body. But there's going to be 10 souls that I'm taking with me.
This is home in New Hampshire, all spruced up for Krista's return, despite the fact that 5-year-old daughter Caroline doesn't like the whole business.
Because I don't want her to go in space, because I just want to stay around my house.
Husband Steve heard the news on the radio.
Everybody who knows her, I think, honestly thought that, you know, there may have been candidates who were certainly her equal, but that there was nobody that would be superior to her.
McAuliffe has already had a taste of what space flight will be like. This was a ride in a plane that simulates zero gravity.
Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading down range.
Lujan or Lujan?
Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%.
Let's install.
We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%. 3 engines running normally. 3 good fuel cells. 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
Roger, go with throttle up. The last words heard from Space Shuttle Challenger. The fireball, the smoke, the debris plunging toward the ocean just east of the Cape Canaveral launch site. Now, for the critical moments of today's disaster, here is slow motion videotape just before the explosion. You can see the first explosion. Hard to tell whether it happens on the main liquid tank or in the solid rocket fuel boosters. Then the devastating wipeout explosion. And carry it a little bit forward because you can see one of the, in the upper right-hand part of your screen, we think you can see one of the solid rocket fuel boosters just sticking out and being blown away. There it is in the upper right-hand quadrant of your screen. One of the 2 solid rocket fuel boosters at this stage still at least partially intact, being blown away from that fireball. That a slow motion replay of the terrible moment this morning, just past 11:30 Eastern time, when the explosion occurred, destroying Space Shuttle Challenger. Now coming up in almost 2 hours since the explosion of the Space Shuttle, NASA still has made no official announcement on the fate of the 7 aboard the Challenger, though no survivors have been sighted. We've been showing you regularly throughout our coverage the live pictures provided by NASA of the scene where the debris, some debris has been sighted in the ocean east of Florida. It's just beyond this land where the debris is. It's very near the launch site itself out in the ocean because, after all, the explosion occurred only a minute and 12 seconds into the flight. Now, let us pause and review for you what we think we know as of this hour. Still no official announcement from NASA as to the fate of the crew of 6 and the school teacher passenger aboard the Space Shuttle. The Space Shuttle Challenger exploded into that gigantic fireball about a minute and 12 seconds after liftoff. Apparently, underscore that word, apparently all seven members aboard the flight were killed. I emphasize again, as Bruce Hall has been doing, that there were no ejection seats aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger. As Bruce pointed out, in the early space shuttles, they had put ejection seats. That's when they had far fewer crew members. But two things quickly became apparent. First of all, those who rode the early shuttles apparently came back and said, listen, you're kidding yourself if you think anyone could survive with an ejection seat if anything goes wrong. And that's point number one. Point number two, as the number of people put aboard the space shuttles grew, it was determined we're only kidding ourselves by putting these ejection seats in, and there were no ejection seats aboard the shuttle this morning. Now, there's been no announcement on the fate of the crew after the explosion this morning, but it appeared there was no way they could survive. You look at the videotape and you say to yourself, how could anyone survive that? No American astronaut ever has been killed in flight. 3 were killed on the launch pad in 1967. The current NASA administrator, William R. Graham, was meeting with congressmen on Capitol Hill about the NASA budget when they saw the disaster on television. Steve Goldstein, who's an aide to Representative Manuel Lujan, who's a Republican of New Mexico, Steve Goldstein said, and I quote, NASA officials told the congressman it doesn't look like any lives were saved, unquote. The other crew members aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger this morning, that is besides schoolteacher Krista McAuliffe of Concord, New Hampshire, were the commander, Francis R. Scobie, 46, the pilot, Michael J. Smith, aged 40, 36-year-old Judith Resnick, Ronald E. McNair, 35 years old, Ellison S. Onizuka, 39, and Gregory B. Jarvis, 41. Schoolteacher McAuliffe, well, they now have the names under the photographs. And let's pause for a second and ponder the faces of the 7 people who were aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger this morning. The $1.2 billion spacecraft, one of 4 in NASA's shuttle fleet, was destroyed, completely obliterated. Parts of the ship fell into the Atlantic about 18 miles southeast of the launch pad. On a slow-motion video rerun of the explosion, as we've shown you, it was difficult to determine the exact source of the explosion. Bruce Hall passed along the theories put forward by veteran observers there. One theory was that the explosion began in one of the solid rocket fuel boosters attached to the side of the main fuel tank. Another of the theories put forward was that the explosion had happened, began very near where the solid rocket booster is attached to the main liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen fuel tank. Liquid hydrogen, keep in mind, is highly explosive. And there was one theory, after looking closely at the slow-motion videotape replay, that the early part of the explosion actually happened in the main fuel tank near where a seam is there. It was difficult to determine, to say the least, the exact source of the explosion, but unmistakably, when the huge fuel tank with nearly 500,000, 500,000 gallons of volatile propellant ruptured, it did tear the Challenger into many, many pieces. NASA said the fine pieces of debris continued to fall into the impact area for nearly 45 minutes. It took 45 minutes before all of the debris, or large portions of it, came down in extremely small pieces. Recovery boats and aircraft were dispatched to the area. They had to wait until the debris stopped raining before they could get into that ocean area to make a search. Paramedics leaped into the water in an effort, they parachuted down in an effort to find any trace of survivors. There is no word of any survivors. After the explosion, the 2 solid fuel rocket booster rockets did separate out and continued to fly crazily out of control in the clear sky. They were both trailing long trails of smoke before they plummeted into the water. One of those solid rocket boosters was seen floating down on its parachute. Recall, that's the way that if a launch goes well, both of the solid rocket boosters are supposed to fall away, fall down in the ocean by parachute, and be recovered and used again. The big tank, the main fuel tank, the one with the liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen, those are not reusable. On previous launches, once the launch goes off well, that big tank drops away and somewhere over the Indian Ocean and is not recovered. Television pictures of the impact area relayed from a helicopter showed no evidence of any large pieces of debris floating in the water. Those are those shots from the helicopter that we've been showing you throughout our coverage. The launch had been delayed repeatedly, most recently because of fears that icicles on the launch pad could harm the shuttle. And as Bruce Hall reported from Cape Canaveral earlier, the launch was delayed about 2 hours this morning while they made an icicle check. That was because of the 28-degree temperature, very unusual for Florida this time of year, that prevailed overnight in Florida. Leslie Stahl, one of our White House correspondents, has been working at the White House this morning along with Bill Plant, our other veteran White House correspondent. Leslie, is there any late word about the president and what he knows?
Yes, Dan. First, let me tell you that there is an assumption here at the White House that nobody could have survived that explosion and that there are no survivors from what happened today. The president did come in and talk to a group of reporters who were having a briefing on the State of the Union, which the president says he will still go ahead and deliver tonight. He talked about the tragedy. He saw it on television. He saw a replay of it only moments after the explosion. He said he was more than saddened. It was a tremendous shock. He says he cannot get the teacher, Krista McCulloch, off his mind, although he did talk about the other brave people and their sacrifice. He talked about the families and how his heart goes out to all of them. He said this would definitely cast a pall over his State of the Union address tonight that was supposed to be very upbeat. He was going to be looking toward the future and, in fact, had written in a passage about Krista McCulloch and the future, the Space Shuttle program, the new frontier. He was asked by the reporters in the room what he would like to have people telling children who might have been especially interested in this flight because a teacher was aboard. And he said that he would like them to talk about Krista McCulloch and the others as pioneers who had sacrificed their life on the great frontier, and that just because of one tragedy we cannot stop going forward. He was asked what if a backlash develops over the space program because of this, and he said that he would be a voice opposing doing anything to stop the program because it is our new frontier and the only frontier we have. I can tell you, Dan, that there is real grief at the White House, as you can well imagine, as I'm sure there is all across the country, but a special grief because Krista McCulloch was here at the White House when she was named to be the teacher to go on this flight. I happened to have been in the room. She did not know till she got here that she'd been the chosen one, and the president made the announcement himself. He was the one who wanted to put citizens aboard. He was asked, well, do you think this should stop the idea of having citizens? And he said, well, everybody who goes up in these space rockets, spaceships are citizens, and that the whole point of the program is to have citizens, and he does not want to see that stopped.
Thank you very much, Leslie Stahl. At the White House, the schoolteacher, Krista McCulloch, was one of 2 women aboard the flight today. The other was astronaut Judy Resnick, who was, in fact, the second woman in space, the second woman behind Sally Ride. And we want to show you something about Judith Resnick in a moment. But just before doing that, we want to pause and underscore the following. We want to stress, as we've tried to do throughout the coverage, that we don't know, nobody knows, nobody has said, nobody can know at this early hour exactly what caused the explosion aboard the Challenger. And NASA has yet to say anything about it. That's something to keep in mind. Now, another thing to keep in mind, we've tried to explain to you as best we can how the launch went this morning, what the situation was as we looked very carefully at that slow-motion videotape, and we've mentioned several times that it appears in the videotape that the explosion, the very first explosion, may have occurred in or around one of the solid rocket boosters. Again, if we can get the model over, we don't want to by any means overwork it, but to try to understand, these are the solid rocket boosters, this is the main fuel tank, shuttle rides on top of it.
Her mother. And those, some of the school children with their caps on. Her mother clearly weeping with pride at that point. Those children
are those the
at the Cape itself, very much like the children who had watched at Krista McAuliffe's school in New Hampshire, as described to us, for minutes did not know what was happening. It looked very much to us as if her parents did not know what was happening for some period of time. John Quinones, ABC's correspondent at the Cape, said to us earlier that in fact many people who were watching at the Cape did not know what was going on. Krista McAuliffe, the first pure civilian, the first teacher in space, with her parents and lots of children in attendance from her school at Cape Canaveral today. 24 space missions had already been accomplished before tragedy occurred on this one. And at 3 o'clock this afternoon, the space agency is going to hold a news conference to try to explain to us what they know. We don't know what they know in terms of what went wrong in this, the world's first reusable spacecraft. ABC's Lynn Scher is standing by with us in Los Angeles. Lynn, what do they look for first? I'm sorry, but what do they look for first?
Well, Peter, I think the first thing they're going to have to do is analyze that tape. They've got to be able to look at it. I assume they will enhance it with a computer, look at it as closely as they can to try to pinpoint where the first flash was, where the explosion took place. I know you've been through this a few times yourself, but here, of course, is the shuttle, the tank with the liquid
fuels those engines. Those are the main engines at the bottom of the spacecraft, which is a kind of engine with short, an airplane with short wings. Everything is normal here.
Of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Roger, roll, Challenger. Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange.
I'm waiting. I got the Russians and the Germans.
Engines beginning throttling down now.
Those are the solid rocket boosters, the long white rockets on either side. They are supposed to separate and then they are recovered via parachute, and the plane, the space shuttle itself, goes on into orbit under normal conditions.
Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs.
APUs are auxiliary power units. Engines at 65%.
57 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
Now he's going to tell them to go to full throttle, and that's when it happens.
Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up. Challenger, go at throttle up.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
And there it was. An eerie, tragic beauty in the skies over Florida today. Tragedy of enormous proportions. 7 people killed, we believe. Their families obviously deeply affected, as is the nation, as is the space program. Here it is in slow-mo. It's hard to imagine that anyone could have survived that. The only solid piece of debris we see is the solid rocket booster off to the side. There were no astronauts in that, of course. The Space Shuttle Challenger itself seems to have come apart. Debris fell into the ocean. recovery vessels were quickly in place, but they couldn't enter the recovery area because the debris continued to fall. They're there now. We've not heard how they're doing at this point. We do expect Senator John Glenn in the Senate gallery within 5 minutes or so. Of course, Senator Glenn is a veteran astronaut. He was the first American to make an orbital flight of the Earth back in the early days of the space program and the Mercury capsule. John Palmer is in New York with additional information for us. John?
Yes, Tom, the Soviet news agency TASS has now made mention of this. Just one line on it. The U.S. Space Shuttle Challenger exploded shortly after takeoff today. There is no comment. The Soviet Union, of course, is the only other country that has sent people up into space, and the Soviet Union has, of course, reported the death of 4 Soviet cosmonauts. Prior to today, 3 American astronauts had lost their lives. There is this word, according to a spokesman for Lloyd's of London, all of the crew members of the shuttle flights are offered the opportunity for life insurance, written by Lloyd's of London, and a spokesman for Lloyd's of London says that only one of the astronauts, and that was Krista McAuliffe, the school teacher, took advantage of that life insurance. She took out a policy of $1 million on her life. She, along with the other 6 members of the Space Shuttle Challenger, now presumed to have been lost shortly after 11:30 this morning when the Space Shuttle Columbia exploded about a minute after launch from Cape Canaveral. Let's go back now to Washington and Tom Brokaw. Tom?
Thank you, John Palmer. There is a problem, and we hope before the afternoon is out to deal with some people who will be here to help you as you deal with your children. We hope to have a child psychologist because a lot of children have been watching the space program, including the students of Krista McAuliffe. Now at the Senate Gallery on Capitol Hill, Senator John Glenn.
But the people that were on the flight today carried our hopes and dreams along with them, and they'll live forever in our memories. And I guess that's the best tribute we can give to them. Our prayers, our sympathy, our condolences go out to their families and friends, and I guess that's about all we can say about them right at this time. It's been an amazing success story up to this very tragic accident today. I think this was, what, the 56th or 57th manned mission, where we're dealing with new complexities and speeds and powers that man has never used before. And we had hoped to push this day back forever, but that was not to be, and we all, I guess, intuitively knew that. So today we don't want to repeat, that's for sure.
Senator, what effect does this have on a space program or any sort of flight test program when something like this happens?
Oh, it delays things, of course, because there will be a very complete investigation. Our view of what happened this morning would be only speculation at this point, although the very slow-motion pictures I saw on one of the channels a little while ago seemed to show the first light coming out of one of the solid rocket cases. Whether that'll turn out to be the cause of the difficulty or not, I don't know. But I wouldn't think that this was... you know, what it'll do to the program or how much it'll be set back will be dependent on the investigation.
Was NASA trying to push too hard on this, Senator?
No, I don't think so. If there's one thing NASA has not done all the way through, it is take a chance on cutting corners. And we've grown accustomed to success. And it's been an amazingly successful program so far. You know, I remember one of the TV commentators, I won't say which network, but one morning talking about when there was a delay, commenting, when are we going to get turn this turkey into an eagle? We'd become so accustomed to getting these things off on time that safety was obviously being, at least in that commentator's mind, was being given short shrift. Why aren't we running these things like a regular airline schedule? Well, the fact that NASA has not done that. They've run it with the idea of safety first and foremost, and that's been the way it's been operated ever since the days when I was in that program many years ago. It's a tribute to them that they have not been goaded under pressure to taking any chances. And we'll just have to wait the accident analysis to see what happened in this case.
Senator, were you watching the blast-off this morning?
I was not. I was in a classified briefing at the time, and one of my staff people brought a note in to me about this, and then I left immediately and went up to my office.
What was your reaction, particularly to the replays you've probably seen?
Oh, my reaction was a profound sense of loss, I guess, that this day had finally come that we'd hoped would never arrive. In some ways, I guess it's, you know, in our human existence, let me be philosophical for a moment. I guess in our human existence there is triumph and there is tragedy. And man tries many things. And we advance as a whole human race because we succeed most of the time. We make advances, whether it's in space or engineering or health or medical things. Sometimes, though, we aren't perfect. And then there's a tragedy that brings us back to our own human frailties and our lack of perfection. And so that's the kind of a day we're faced with now. It's been an amazingly successful series of triumphs through the years. But it also is fraught with the possibility of tragedy, and that's what we came up against today.
When you say that this was a day that was pushed back for safety, was it inevitable that it would finally come?
Well, I think everyone that's ever had any connection with the program has felt that someday there would be a loss in flight. We're dealing with tremendous powers and speeds. You're traveling in orbit at 5 miles a second and trying to get back into the atmosphere from that kind of speed. And so, are we going to be perfect forever? I guess the answer was proven this morning that the answer to that is no. But that doesn't mean that man doesn't keep trying in these areas and that we're not just as dedicated to seeing that this kind of research goes on.
Senator, you've been part of a small and very select community of people, the community of astronauts. What does this do to that community when something like this happens?
Well, we've never had something like this happen before, except for the pad fire, the fire on the pad that claimed 3 lives. Gus Grissom, Ned White, and Roger Chafee back in '67, I believe it was. So we went through that tragedy then, but that was not an in-flight accident. Obviously, there will be a shared sense of loss in the whole astronaut group and community, everybody associated with the whole program, whether astronauts or all those in the supporting functions. But I'm sure their dedication is going to be to find out what caused this and correct it and get on with the next flight.
Do astronauts just simply accept this as part of the job?
I think any time you go into flying or test flying, or which all of us were in prior to being in the astronaut program early on, you accept risks, but you feel that the risks are worth it for the country and the importance of what you're doing. And you're willing to take those risks.
Communications between the two of us. Stay with me, if you will, Bruce, because there's a bulletin on the Associated Press just in from Washington. The Associated Press says, and I quote, President Reagan's State of the Union speech scheduled tonight has been canceled. House Republican leader Robert Michael's office is said to have just announced this. Yes, I understand this is contrary to information that we had from the White House and our White House correspondents just a short while ago. We have no independent confirmation of this. The last official word we had was that President Reagan would indeed, on the advice of Donald Regan, his White House Chief of Staff, go ahead with the State of the Union speech tonight. But the Associated Press now reports on a bulletin basis, speech canceled. President Reagan's State of the Union speech scheduled tonight has been canceled, according to the House Republican leader Robert Michael's office. We'll be in the process immediately of checking and double-checking that, and we'll keep you posted as we go along. Our last report was that the President intended to go ahead with the State of the Union address tonight as previously scheduled at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. We see scenes from the White House briefing room on one of our monitors here, and it may be that Larry Speaks, the President's spokesman, will be out fairly shortly to give us the official word on whether the President's speech is or is not remaining on the schedule for tonight. At our last official word, it was on the schedule, but the AP says it has now been canceled. We had said some time ago that we were going to discuss the fact that Judith Resnick, the second woman in space, was aboard this space shuttle this morning. We're going to hold on for a moment and not do that, and if you see me looking off to the side, I want to explain to you why. I do have a monitor in which the White House briefing room is up, and our thought was that perhaps Larry Speaks would be appearing shortly to tell us whether the President's speech had been canceled or not. So if you see me looking off to one side, that's the reason that is being done. The NASA officials continue to be silent about what happened this morning and why it happened. There's not been any official announcement that all 7 persons aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger perished. It seems inconceivable after seeing the videotape that anyone could have survived, but NASA is in the uncomfortable position of not being able to definitely determine whether anyone survived the flight, and understandably they have made no announcement as of yet. We were saying earlier about the dedication of the National Aeronautics Space Administration people, everyone from the janitor up through the secretaries, to the engineers, to the scientists, to the administrators, to the backers of the NASA program in Congress, how dedicated they've been to excellence and to safety. And the fact that they've got 56 manned U.S. space missions, this is the first time there's been any serious accident in flight. There was that 1967 fatality, 3 astronauts killed on the launch pad, but nothing in flight before this. And there have been 24 space shuttle missions, 56 manned space shots by the United States, 24 space shuttle missions, all of them in safety. A remarkable achievement, and all of them under close public scrutiny, all of them open to coverage all the way through. Only this morning, for the first time in flight, a disaster. NASA said that the explosion occurred about 1 minute and 12 seconds into the mission at a point where the astronauts were beginning to throttle their engines up to maximum thrust. Now, this was after the astronauts throttled their engines down to a 60% level at the 35-second mark. At the picture, you have this tremendous liftoff at the 30.
This is what happened. That is the shuttle at the bottom half of the rocket apparatus. Now the explosion begins. It's very hard to tell, but it does seem to me that it did not happen within that solid rocket booster on this side of the spacecraft. It could have happened, of course, on the other one. But there is the possibility as well that it might have happened with the external tank. That is the big tank, and we're going to repeat some of this for those of you who are watching us continually here, because we know that people are just joining us along the way. But that big orange tank is, in effect, a bomb. It is a large vessel carrying 560,000 pounds of highly volatile oxygen and hydrogen. It feeds the fuel to the main tanks, which are at the bottom of the space shuttle itself. And as they went to full throttle, from 65% power to full throttle, 104%, it was very shortly after that that the explosion occurred. So it does appear that there may have been some connection between going to full throttle and the explosion itself. And given the size of the explosion and the fact that we saw one of the solid rockets peel off to the side, it appears that that's where it may have happened. At the White House now, Deputy Press Secretary Larry speaks.
The State of the Union address that was scheduled for this evening. He will address the Congress and the American people on next Tuesday. The President, in addition, has asked the Vice President to go immediately to Cape Canaveral's Kennedy Space Center, along with the acting NASA Director, Bill Graham. The Vice President will carry with him the President's personal concern for those courageous Americans who were aboard the space shuttle. In addition, the President will speak to the American people from the Oval Office later this evening regarding this tragedy. The President, since learning of the tragedy shortly before noon, has conferred with Don Regan, who in turn consulted with Speaker Tip O'Neill and Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole. They concurred in the President's decision to delay his State of the Union. A few moments ago, the President met in the Oval Office with NASA Director Graham and instructed him to fly to the Cape with the Vice President to begin an effort to find out the cause of this tragedy. And then the President said to go forward with the nation's space program. The President said, and I quote, "These people were dedicated to the exploration of space. We could do no more to honor them, these courageous Americans, than to go forward with the program."
Can you tell us some of the reasoning in the decision to postpone, since, as you know, the President's first reaction was to go ahead with tonight's speech?
I think the President, like all Americans, has seen this tragedy unfold on television and has felt keenly what those family members must have felt watching that shuttle go into the air at the Cape. First pride, and then second, horror. The President feels that these same emotions are being experienced by people all over this nation at this moment. And with the consultation of Congress that's taken place in the last hour or so, the President thought it was entirely appropriate that his State of the Union be deferred until, and let him address the American people on what's happening here tonight.
Administrator Graham tell him finally what happened? Does he have information, confirmation?
No, the NASA has issued a statement indicating simply that there was an explosion aboard the space shuttle shortly after it lifted off from the Cape this morning, and that a search and rescue mission is underway. That is continuing at this hour and will continue until all efforts to find out what the situation in there are exhausted.
Does the President believe...
Right. Great.
Larry, is the President also going to cancel his State of the Union activities for the balance of the weekend? What time is the other remarks tonight?
The President will, will, for the balance of the week, continue on his previously announced schedule, with the exception of those activities which were designed as a follow-up to the State of the Union. They will be rescheduled for next week. The time of the address to the nation has not been determined, pending definite word from NASA about the situation.
HHS, Treasury, and the high school he is not going to visit now.
That's right.
Larry,
Larry, can you tell us, does the President have any plans to travel or attend any memorial service for the...
Well, at the moment, the NASA is still conducting its search mission there, and of course there's been no memorial service set. The Vice President does go with the personal expression of the part of the President of his concern to those families there, and no travel plans are set as yet.
Larry, two questions. First of all, I know you haven't had any official word, but is the White House operating on the basis that all of the people on the shuttle are dead?
Well, Chris, like every American, we hope, and until we find out otherwise, that hope will continue.
And secondly, to follow up on an earlier question, we were told by the President a few moments ago that he intended to go ahead with the State of the Union. In fact, said while it would cast a pall, the business of governing the nation must go on. What changed his mind in really a very short period of time?
Well, as I indicated to your colleague over here just a moment ago, is that the President, like all Americans, watched this on television, and he felt very keenly the emotion that must be felt by the families of those down there and that had to watch this event in person, and very keenly what the American people must be feeling. He consulted with the congressional leadership, and the consensus opinion of the executive and the legislative branch was that it was appropriate to postpone.
Larry, can you tell us what information the President is getting other than from television at this point?
Well, as I just said, the President has conferred with the director of NASA, and he brought him up to date, providing him with as much information as he can. There is not an extensive body of information at the moment that exists. NASA is looking into it as quickly as they can, and as I say, a search mission goes on.
Is there a special task force either at the White House or somewhere that's keeping him informed, or are there special communications channels set up?
As is always, when there is an event of this nature that occurs anywhere around the world, the White House Situation Room keeps on top of the events. What happened was, as soon as this event occurred almost simultaneously with the television coverage of it, the Situation Room was informed by NASA and has kept abreast of it with an open line to NASA at the Cape since that time.
Was this well, I was going to go back again on where the idea of postponing the speech first initiated. Did the President initiate the idea?
Yes, the President initiated the idea of postponing the speech.
Larry, will the shuttle program be suspended at least until the investigation is through?
Those determinations have not been made. The President indicated to Bill Graham that he should find out the cause of it and then proceed. Now, exactly how that dovetails with future flights will just have to be determined as a result of what NASA determines in their investigation.
So on the consideration of whether any civilians will be permitted to continue on shuttle flights, is that also part of the investigation?
Well, to echo the President's words that all of these people were Americans. They were all interested in space. They all came first with courage and second in a spirit of volunteering for this mission. And whether there'll be any change in that, I don't know. But at the moment, I don't think there's any inclination. Joe?
Has the President attempted to contact the family members of anyone who was on the shuttle?
The President has not yet done that, no, except to send the Vice President in expression of his concern.
Is there any feeling here that NASA was pushing too hard? There was a very ambitious program. Was it 15 launches for this year?
I think NASA has a very good record of safety and a very cautious human approach to space exploration, and they have taken those precautions. This is a tragedy of major proportions and one that concerns us all. But for the moment, there is no finger pointing at NASA as far as their safety record.
Well, the question arises particularly because in recent launches there have been some glitches that have come up. As you know, they had a problem with the door, the hatch on this, and their drill wouldn't work and all of that. Does that not give the impression that they may be pushing too fast?
I can't make that judgment from here, but I think if you would look back at other space launches in the Mercury and Apollo program, you would find that there have been postponements. These not because of glitches, but because of an extensive safety program that finds these glitches before launch.
Can you be more specific about what the Vice President will be doing later today specifically, and also the postponement on the State of the Union pushed back the schedule for the budget and other things that were scheduled for next week?
The Vice President's schedule, once he arrives at the Cape, has not been determined, since it's just within the last few moments that the President has asked him to go down.
Well, what's his specific charge? I mean, when
his specific charge, once again, is to express the President's concern to the families and to accompany the Director of NASA down to the Cape in order to see that the President's directions for an immediate look into the tragedy, into the explosion, is accomplished.
Is he overseeing an investigation into this?
I don't think that you can say that yet, Norm. I think this matter is entirely in the hands of the NASA people at the present time, and I don't know of any. There's no further planning beyond that. Question on the budget, that has not been determined. It would be my inclination to say that the budget will probably go up on Wednesday, with the State of the Union on Tuesday. I think the Graham-Rudman law requires that it go up by February 5th, and that they will do. Andrea, and then I'm going to go all the way to the back and work forward.
I just want to follow on Norm. Is it the President's view that perhaps an independent investigation outside of NASA is what is required on the pacing of the program?
I think everyone is leapfrogging well ahead of events at present. This tragedy is now only hours old. You have a series of actions taken by the President, including a charge to the Director of NASA to find out what happened. And until we do some preliminary studies, none of these questions have answers. So, Pat?
Has the decision been made to have the President officially disclose tonight in his speech what happened, or will we continue to get details from NASA throughout the day, or are they going to hold the President's speech?
NASA will continue to keep you abreast of everything as they know it, as they always have through the entire history of the American space program. So, John?
Larry, you made a point of saying early on that there would be no greater way to honor those who apparently have died in this mission than to continue on with the space program. Is this a deliberate effort to try to counteract any feelings against the program because of the tragedy?
John, the only deliberate effort we're making at the moment is to show our deep concern, our deep emotion, and our desire that America continue in the space program. That's our entire motive, lock, stock, and barrel. Joanna?
Larry, has the President expressed any rue or regret about his proposal to send civilians in space?
The President is obviously concerned about every person that he, as the chief executive officer of the government, he as the President directs He directs people every day, either directly or indirectly, to conduct missions on the part of the government, the military, NASA, and those. It's a fact of life when the man sits in the Oval Office. He has to make these decisions, and I have not heard him express any regret. Concern, yes. Deep emotion, yes. Sorrow, yes. But regret is not not that. It was the decision made, as he said. These individuals are all Americans, and they're all believers in the space program, and that's what's in his mind. So, Walter?
Larry, does the President plan today to speak with any of the relatives, family of any of the...
that hasn't been determined yet, no. Frank?
Can you give us any indication as to what the First Lady was doing at the time that this information became available and what her reaction was?
I don't. We can check with her office, if you will, and see what we can get.
Because the Europeans are able to put up satellites in with unmanned vehicles, doesn't this accident argue per se that unmanned vehicles are a preferable way to put up satellites in orbit?
Once again, I have been a silent observer of the space program and not one that's actively involved, and I'm not competent to answer that.
All right. So. As you recall, the President made the decision to send a teacher into space. Can you tell us on what he based that decision and who suggested the timing and when the time was right for that mission?
Well, Mike, I don't want to come down hard on you, but what's in the President's mind right now is to find out what happened and to show those families of those people that he's concerned. And that's all that's on his mind at the moment.
Are you operating on the assumption that this is the result of some technological problem, or has anyone suggested the possibility it might be an act of terrorism?
There have been no suggestions either way.
Thank you.
Larry speaks in the White House press briefing room, just completing that live briefing to reporters who are assembled there. He made several major announcements. The President's State of the Union address tonight has been postponed until Tuesday of next week. The White House saying that the President initiated that decision. We also had word from Capitol Hill that both House Speaker Thomas P. Tip O'Neill and the Senate Majority Leader Robert Dole of Kansas concurred in that decision, that there were efforts being made up there even before the White House came to its decision that they ought to, in fact, postpone tonight's State of the Union address. The President, however, will address the nation tonight from the Oval Office. The time, as of now, undetermined. As soon as we have that time for you, of course, we'll bring it to you. Vice President Bush and the administrator of NASA will be dispatched to the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral, Florida today, where they will be the President's personal representatives to determine what has happened there. It has now been about 2.5 hours since this tragedy occurred, this traumatic shock to the nation. 7 astronauts apparently lost in a gigantic explosion about 5 miles up in space, about 1 minute and 15 seconds after the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger today. It was witnessed by the parents, the husband, and the children of Krista McAuliffe, who is the school teacher, of course, riding along today, and apparently she has been lost. Also, members of her 3rd grade class were there with a banner that read, "Go, Krista, go." In Concord, New Hampshire, the high school had been assembled in an auditorium, 1,500 altogether, to watch on television this launch. And across the country, for that matter, young people have been watching what happened today, and it's bound to have a traumatic effect on youngsters as well as those of us who are grown-ups and think that we are used to the unexpected in life and find out that we are not. To help us deal with all of that now is Dr. Ravenscroft, Ken Ravenscroft, who is from Georgetown University. He's a child psychiatrist. Dr. Ravenscroft, as the parent of youngsters, what would I say to them tonight as we discuss this around the dinner table?
Well, I think one of the major things actually is to find out, first of all, to let them know you're aware of what's happened, and then to find out from them what they've been through so far that day. Obviously, parents have to react. They're stunned. They're in grieving.
Of the shuttle's wreckage. You may have noticed it for a second or so there. The shuttle appeared to still be flying after the explosion, and suddenly it corkscrewed out of control and plunged toward the ocean.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
Major malfunction, meaning disaster aboard the shuttle in space. A nightmare for NASA. And now we take you to the last seconds of Shuttle Challenger in slow motion. At this point, all appears well. Then suddenly a small explosion, hard to tell exactly where it is, and then this. In the upper right-hand corner of your screen, a piece of the solid fuel rocket booster blown away in the explosion. The spaceship was throttling up at one of the most dangerous periods of the launch when the explosion occurred. Now, as you just heard a few moments ago from Presidential Spokesman Larry Speaks, earlier it was said, the President's Chief of Staff, Donald Regan, and others passed along the word the President would go ahead with his State of the Union address tonight. Larry Speaks then came out and confirmed some of what we reported to you earlier. The President has now decided to cancel his State of the Union address that was scheduled for...
A picture-perfect launch against the bright blue skies of the Atlantic. And those great
engines beginning throttling down now.
Cigar case-looking things underneath the shuttle, the big white, if you have color, solid booster fuel rockets on the outside, and in the middle, that enormous tank of liquid hydrogen and oxygen, the main tank.
Engines at 65%.
Listen to mission control at Houston as they communicated with us some 4 hours ago.
57 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go with throttle up. Challenger, go with throttle up.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
Go with throttle up. Increase your power to make orbit. And it will be hard to forget the voice of the mission control communicator, talking on as he reads off his telemetry, not aware, as those who were watching it were aware, that this tragedy had occurred.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation.
The search in the Atlantic, about 8 to 10 miles off in the immediate area of Cape Canaveral, goes on. Here's Lieutenant Colonel Robert Nicholson of the Air Force to describe what they're doing.
And what role do you play? You understand we were delayed by approximately an hour after the accident from entering the scene because of falling debris. There was the range safety officer at Cape Canaveral, looking at his radar, determined that debris was falling from the altitudes, and I don't have the highest altitude, but debris continued to fall for 50 minutes and more. And obviously you can't send aircraft and ships into an area where debris is falling, where they themselves may be in danger.
Been delayed a couple of hours today because of some icicles. It finally got off the ground at about 11:38, and as you can see, it lifted off the pad very smoothly. There appear to be no difficulties whatsoever. But it was not long after that that fragments from the $1.2 billion spacecraft and the 7 astronauts aboard until that fell into the ocean. There is doubt, of course, that any astronaut or person could survive. The explosion occurred as the Challenger was about 10 miles high, speeding toward orbit at 1,977 miles an hour. This is some members of the family of Krista McAuliffe, the school teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, watching there at the stands. Her husband, Stephen, was also there, as well as her 9-year-old daughter. We're moving up now to the time. There's a very close-up picture of this brilliant flash in the sky, this explosion. The theory being, obviously, it had to do with one of the fuel tanks. Just what happened, nobody knows, but it could well have been the tearing of a seam that attaches the spacecraft itself to the main rocket engine. They are moving to the point of separation. The explosion occurred about 30 seconds before the solid booster rockets normally fall off, and you many times have seen that. Here's the close-up, and there is the explosion aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger happening about 11:39 Eastern Time, and you see now what appears to be one of the solid booster rockets. This again is the family. This is Christy McAuliffe, astronaut, or rather Teacher McAuliffe's family there. Her mother, her father there, other members of the family. At first they didn't know what was happening. Then it became clear when they said they had a major problem, and then the communications people down at NASA at the Cape, over the public relations or public address system, stated that there had been an explosion. A tragedy indeed. It is the first loss of American life aboard in flight, aboard the shuttle or any other kind of spacecraft in flight. Of course, there was a tragedy back in January of 1967 when Virgil Grissom and 2 other astronauts died in a fire aboard an Apollo spacecraft. But since that time, there has been no loss of life until today, when we can only but sadly presume that 7 Americans, including the first school teacher, the first, if you will, regular person, regular citizen up in space, apparently have been lost. One of the next flights was going to be taking a journalist into space. As the program was very ambitious for this year, they hope to send as many as 15 shuttle flights. There have been delays on the first one. There were delays and on this one also, several days of delays because of weather, one thing or another. You'll recall yesterday the problem seemed to have been with a screwdriver that delayed them for some time, and by that time the weather was not very favorable. This morning, there was the scheduled liftoff was 9:38 Eastern Time, but there was a problem there with the freezing temperatures overnight. It dropped below the freezing point, and icicles developed on the main body of the spacecraft. That concerned the officials at NASA a little bit, so they delayed the flight. They even sent some people there to chip off some of those icicles. Then they determined that it really wasn't going to be much of a problem. About 10 o'clock, it became above the freezing point, and they thought there would be no danger of the icicles during launch falling off and hitting the protective shield, those tiles. So nobody knows at this particular time what the problem was, but it is indeed a tragedy of the first magnitude in the space program. There's a lot of speculation that we've heard this afternoon of what this means to the space program. Obviously, there's going to be a delay while no launches ever takes place. That's an old NASA rule, until they find out what happened on the last one, even if it's just a minor glitch. And of course, we have more than a minor glitch. We have a full-blown tragedy. Let's go back now to Washington, D.C. and Tom Brokaw. Tom?
Thank you, John. Dan Molina is in Houston now, and we each have, I think, a model of the Space Shuttle as it is attached to the 2 solid rocket boosters, which are on either side of it here. I'll turn it so that you can see. These are the solid rocket boosters, and this is the external tank that we've been talking about all day long. What appeared to happen is that something happened down here where it attaches to the shuttle itself, and it fuels these main engines, and it appears to our naked eye, and not expert eye, although we've all been watching these for some time, it appears that that's where the explosion might have occurred just after these main engines were pushed forward to 104% or full throttle. They run at about 65% for the opening moments of the flight, up to about 1 minute, and then they push them forward so that they'll have enough to get into the orbit that they want to achieve. Under normal conditions, these 2 solid rocket boosters then would peel away and they would be parachuted back to Earth. And this big external tank, which is a very thin-skinned vessel containing, as I indicated earlier, almost 600,000 pounds of hydrogen and oxygen, then that just breaks up and goes off into space. But what happened today is that the entire system came apart. It exploded in a gigantic fireball. Dan Molina at Houston now, who's also, as I understand it, has one of these models. Dan, any further word down there, even speculation from some of the NASA officials?
Tom, interestingly, I had a conversation by phone about 20 minutes ago with a man whose name is very, very well known in the NASA space program, Dr. Max Faget. I know that name is familiar to you. Dr. Faget is well known as the father of the space shuttle. Dr. Faget is retired from NASA now, but he was the chief designer of the space shuttle. I called him at his office. He now works for a private consulting firm, and asked him what he thought, what his first impressions were. He said that unless something shows up on long-range telescopes or on telemetry, we may never know what happened. And Dr. Faget said that that would be the worst thing of all, because there would be no way to push on from that point. I asked him, Tom, about the fact that the explosion occurred, as you pointed out, at the point where they throttle up to 140% of the shuttle's capacity. He then said, and perhaps it is a revealing comment, he said, yes, that is a glaring coincidence. I asked him if there were any flaws historically that he could recall, any things that concerned him or his team as he designed the shuttle that could possibly have resulted in something like this. He said no, but he remembered again that that happened, the explosion happened at the moment when there is the most pressure on the shuttle. He called it highly loaded at that point, the point when, if anything was to happen, it would be the most disastrous result, and that, of course, was a disastrous result that we have seen. The orbital flight testing program, that was the first 4 flights of the space shuttle. During those 4 flights, there was a lot of instrumentation, extra instrumentation on the shuttle.
You just gave us, please.
Okay, if you run the tape, Dan, I'll try to do a voiceover on it.
Thank you. It's going to take us just a second here, Mr. Krupp, to get the videotape re-queued.
While we're waiting, Dan, another thing that might be a factor in this problem is the abnormal weather conditions that Florida was experiencing. Okay, we're running the tape now, and everything appears to be normal at this point. And when we switch from this tail shot to the side shot, you see those little flame leaks? And if you could go very slow motion through that area, you can see these flame leaks, and then you can see one of them impact right on the vehicle. There you can see the little flame leaks just forward of the nozzle.
Let's try to stop it right there if we can. When you talk about flame leaks in the middle left-hand center of your screen.
Right, now these appear to be coming out of the left SRB just forward of the nozzle area, but it's hard to tell. You know, they could be coming from the tank too. But
excuse me, Leo, but by SRB you mean solid rocket booster is SRB.
That's right.
You think they appear to be coming out of there?
It appears to be that it's coming out of the area of the left SRB nozzle, just forward of the nozzle.
Now that's the solid rocket booster, not the liquid fuel tank.
No, the liquid fuel tank I don't think would have flame leaks of that nature, but it's hard to tell. NASA, when they get their data, might be able to determine this. But once this explosion occurs, then you later see what appears to be the right SRB coming out of this cloud, and it's still fairly intact. But once the explosion occurred, the whole vehicle became probably separated, and I don't think it's significant to say that the one SRB came off ahead of the other one.
Leo Krupp,
There you can see the SRB coming out.
Right, just in the upper right-hand quarter of the screen.
Yes. Now, I assume that's the right SRB, but I can't be certain, of course.
Leo Krupp, you've worked with us before on our little models, and if you can watch your monitor there, I think it's, insofar as we can, we want people to understand exactly what happened. NASA will at some point, we hope soon, but as soon as they know, tell us why it happened. Now, Leo Krupp, the former Rockwell shuttle research pilot, has gone through talking about the SRBs. These are the solid rocket boosters on the side of the space shuttle. This
fans and so many friends, there was an absolutely celebratory atmosphere before the launch occurred this morning. You will recall that they'd all hoped it was going to go off yesterday and had been quite disappointed and in some instances quite indignant that it hadn't gone off, but there was a problem with a hatch door yesterday. And then this morning the weather was good, even though there'd been some icing overnight, and the weather had been good both at the pad and 20,000 feet where they'd had some very severe wind yesterday, and they settled in this morning to watch their teacher go into space.
Looking at all the contingency operations and awaiting word from any recovery forces in the downrange field.
And the transformation in Concord from joy and pride to shock and to sadness, reflected all over.
By Virgil Gus Grissom. It was Lieutenant Colonel Ed White, of course, and Roger Chaffee. And they were taken out and put in the capsule aboard the big Apollo 1 rocket, the Saturn rocket. And it was there that a flash fire occurred, and they were unable to get out, and they were all killed. The burned capsule. We were stunned by that one as well, I remember vividly, because once again the can-do attitude of NASA left us all with the impression that nothing really could go wrong, that these experts who know things right down to the last digit point, one kind or another, had it all figured out. Well, we learned then that there can be tragedies involved in the space program, but it's been now almost 20 years actually, since there's been another death, and today apparently we've had 7 of them, including a school teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, and Judy Resnick, a woman member of the astronaut corps who talked recently with Dan Molina about the presence of Krista McCall.
Years ago, January 27, 1967, a confident astronaut crew, Virgil Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee, they met death when fire swept their Apollo 1 command module during a ground test. In 1970, astronaut James Lovell floated in weightlessness, but then Apollo 13 exploded on the way to the moon.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. We've had a main B bus underboat.
We had a main B bus underboat. An oxygen tank had been mishandled during manufacturing. Apollo 13 finally returned safely to Earth. The dangers of space travel apply to all. The Soviet Union, the only other nation to send manned vehicles into space, has reported the deaths of at least 4 cosmonauts. On October 12, 1964, a Soviet cosmonaut completed a successful 24-hour space odyssey, but in 1967, he would become the first person to die during a space flight when his Soyuz 1 crashed after re-entry. With us tonight in Colorado Springs, Colorado, is an authority on the Soviet space program. He is Nicholas Johnson, advisory scientist for Teledyne Brown Engineering. Good evening, and thank you very much for being with us. The Soviet Union, at last report, had reported today's American space disaster in one line. Does this put them ahead? Can it put them ahead?
No, it doesn't put them ahead.
And how much do we know about the Soviet accidents over the years? Now, I mentioned that I know we're having some audio problems there, and we hope those get cleared up for you.